Hello, my name is Ron Dorn, and I would like to present a lecture for GCU 113. The presentation is about a landmark policy or a series of landmark policies for the United States. I apologize for my voice. I'm having voice issues, but I need to record this presentation, so I appreciate your patience. The lecture are policies surrounding America's environmental legislation. There are three takeaways or objectives of this presentation: that prior to the Republican administration of Richard Nixon, environmental disasters devastated people's health and were not uncommon, setting up lifelong problems like cancer, and that bipartisan policies established under a Republican president set up the EPA and led to legal protection for air and water. The balance between regulation and pollution is still an ongoing policy debate. Before the Nixon administration, environmental disasters were devastating. Compare the Hudson River now to then. What you see with trash, needles, pesticides was commonplace. Hard to believe, but it was what was going on. Before the Nixon administration, there were big events like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring that shocked the nation about how pesticides could get into birds and move up through the food chain, even into people. Rivers were catching on fire. The Detroit River had a massive oil spill, and this was at a time when the Apollo astronauts were looking back at the Earth as a self-contained island amidst a desert of space. Before Nixon, DDT was a common insecticide that Rachel Carson was studying, but it was advertised as being wonderful for animals, for agriculture, but it was associated with cancer increases and with declines of bald eagles and other species. So what happened was DDT was sprayed as an insecticide, very, very effective insecticide, but it was bioaccumulated. Water got into zooplankton, got into fish, and basically the concentrations of DDT increased up the food chain. And this is what Rachel Carson studied. There were also PCBs in coolant, plasticizer, carbonless paper manufacturing associated with birth defects and cancer. There were big events like dioxin contamination of Times Beach, where birds began to drop dead and horses lost their hair and died, and daughters of human beings became ill with nosebleeds, abdominal pain, diarrhea. It was horrific, and these events were commonplace. So there was a growth of environmentalism in the 1960s, and this came to a head at Earth Day in 1970. But let me continue. Before the Nixon administration, smog was very common. Look at ozone levels in LA. They peaked in the 50s and 60s and began to decline only after the EPA came into effect. So President Nixon signs NEPA, which is an event that required an Council on Environmental Quality to advise the President and review federal agency policies with environmental impact statements. The idea is before an agency does anything, the National Environmental Protection Act requires that it be reviewed. And the EPA was established that brought together lots of environmental organizations in the government under one roof. So NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, was signed by President Nixon to create a body and a policy to protect the environment for the present and future generations. The law applies only to federal agencies and requires that they study the impact of an action. So here's an example of different agencies in the administration, the executive branch, that were combined into the EPA. And the EPA was the organization that Congress used with the Clean Air Act of 1970. Congress authorized the EPA to set national air quality, auto emission, anti-pollution standards. For example, it led to the catalytic converter, which reduces a lot of smog. And it led to restrictions on lead-based paints. Before, children's cribs were painted with lead-based paints, and the kids would gnaw on the lead-based paints and get lead poisoning. So the EPA used science to establish dangerous air pollution levels. The EPA also banned DDT. Then Congress passed the Clean Water Act, which was to maintain clean water, clean lakes, clean wetlands, and the Oceans Dumping Act to not dump oil and pollution within close proximity to the coastline. So the Clean Water Act, well, there were efforts before to help protect, but the Cuyahoga River, when it caught on fire, became the catalyst for change. So the Clean Water Act started in 72, but it underwent revisions in 77 and then again in 1987 because there was new knowledge that required amendments. The EPA continued, based on science, to phase out leaded gasoline, to phase out toxic substances. The Safe Drinking Water Act supplemented the EPA's efforts, and cancer-causing pesticides were banned. So here's a graph of the EPA's budget during the Nixon administration, Reagan, the first Bush, and then G.W. Bush, Obama, and Trump. You'll notice that the EPA's budget basically has slowly increased, except when Reagan came in and then when Trump came in. So you had a lot of Republican presidents. Nixon, the first Bush, the second Bush, all supporting environment protection as a bipartisan issue. The EPA generally works very slowly, but it can act fast. So it could speed up efforts to reduce risks to children, or things like asbestos, which can cause massive issues, cancer of the lungs, school problems for kids. So the idea is the EPA takes its time, very careful on the science, but when something really dangerous happens, they can act quickly. there were a lot of statutes that the EPA sort of combined and administers. Just look at the list here. And it continues here. The EPA is the organization that allows the administration and rule setting of different standards, like the Superfund site, the toxic control substances. It's the organization that enforces rules. In the past, this was all bipartisan protection. But now it's become part of culture wars. There was a time when Republicans were for environmental protection, really between Nixon and 2010. But it's become now part of the culture wars that House Republicans are now pushing to rein in the EPA after Trump slashed its budget. Here's basically a great divide between Republicans and Democrats for their support for and against environmental protection. Part of it might relate to the idea that climate change is woke, and woke is evil or bad somehow to some in this culture war. So the idea is that if the Democrats are concerned about global warming and climate change, and some Republicans don't think it exists, well, somehow you have to drag all environmental legislation down the tubes. There's acidification of oceans, endangering coral reefs, the Arctic warming, oil pollution, disappearing rainforests, species that are going extinct. Are these woke, or are these issues that affect us all? So in conclusion, a major landmark set of policies is America's environmental legislation. From the 1600s to the 1890s, it was commonplace to dispose of all forms of pollution in the water and in the air. But events like the Dust Bowl in the 1930s and the Keystone pesticide disaster that left many people dead and dying, the notorious LA killer smog, New York State's Love Canal, Pennsylvania's Denora air pollution deaths, and Virginia's allied chemical ketone contamination. Basically, there's always been a battle between money and health. But that balance shifts now. Far pendulum swings from let's do away with all regulation and let's put the regulation back in. It's something that we'll all have to deal with in today's politics. But in terms of landmark legislation, there's no question that all of these events and policies are a key landmark policy set for the United States. I appreciate your patience with my voice.